Hi, I'm Rachel. I think Matt just gave a plug for program managers at New Relic. Yes, that's what I do now, and that's what I will continue to do, just managing other things. So I work on our customer solutions group. So I work on strategy around training our customers and what that looks like. But then I'll get to run our ERGs, which I don't want to say is more fun, because there might be a boss in here, but is equally as fun. So, all right. So inclusion is awesome. This is our CEO, and I actually really liked hearing Aaron talk about how amazing it is to work here. This is not a shameless plug for New Relic for me. It is really awesome to work here. This is our CEO. His name is Lou Cerny. Can I have a show of hands if anyone has heard of Lou Cerny? Don't raise your hand if you work at New Relic, Cato. And he's really passionate about inclusion, so much that if anyone is at the Google crowd, we have OKRs here. One of our OKRs for our company is creating more diverse and inclusive teams for fiscal year 19, which is just extremely awesome. So what I'm going to talk to you about is about how our brain interprets situations in which we're excluded. So what that feels like, what the results of that, but like literally what's happening in our brain when that happens, because we all know what it feels like, but what is actually happening in our brains. I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about sort of the cognitive effects of when we feel like we don't belong in an environment. And this is coming from like a purely global perspective. Our brains are relatively global things. They're responding to the same threats and the same stimulus as other brains in other countries. So this is like a level set for us. We need to just think about this as humanity in general. So I'll be talking about what happens, again, when it's not an inclusive environment, some things that we can do to retrain our brains, and then I'm going to talk to one of the most genius, I'm going to pass it off to one of the most genius humans I know, Paloma, who's going to just rock your world with hiring practices. So this is actually a quote from our illustrious CEO who was dancing on the previous slide. A more diverse company starts with inclusion. This was something that I wrote down and then watched over and over and over again on the recording when he said this, because it really got me thinking. I've been doing diversity and inclusion work at New Relic for coming up on 2 years, and we seem to focus so much on the diversity aspect, which is important, don't get me wrong. Like, it's very important to focus on diversity. But can we have diversity without inclusion? That's kind of the little seed that got planted when he said this. And I was like, I should do a talk on that sentence. And so this is the talk based on that sentence. And so I wanted to give you a little bit of background on me. One big thing about this work, one big thing about making connections in our communities and with each other and at our companies is being a little vulnerable, which is not super easy and is definitely not a default for most people. So I just want to tell you, why am I talking about inclusion? What like qualifies me to do this? Yeah, I've done some stuff at New Relic. I created some programs, tried to help some things, worked on some company policies, but why am I talking to you about inclusion? I am talking to you about inclusion because exclusion has actually been kind of a key part of my life. So I'm adopted, and if anyone here is adopted, I had no knowledge of my birth parents ever. Just growing up, they were just a thing. But there leads to be something like this need to know where you came from, this need to connect to your group, your people. And that has gotten me thinking for years about how do we make people feel belong? Like, how do we make people feel like they belong? What things can we control? How do our brains control this? I'm a researcher by nature, so I kind of approach this like a research project. It's like I will become the foremost expert in inclusion. But I also have this passion at work too. I started a program called the Allyship at New Relic, which is just someone was like, hey, we should have a group of allies who help our ERGs. I said, okay, cool, I'll do that. So we have a fully functioning 200 strong group called Allyship here. We run trainings every month in San Francisco and Portland on ally skills in the workplace for people with privilege who may be able to affect change at higher levels than we are. So it's really awesome. So this is something I live and breathe. Someone even joked, like, is this just a presentation based on a bunch of books you read? Essentially. So I think the first thing to talk about is the difference between diversity and inclusion. It seems pretty obvious, but we also lump them together pretty haphazardly. It's just D&I, diversity and inclusion, but they're not the same. So to give an example of the difference, I have this beautiful but very easy metaphor. Diversity. Were you invited to the dance? Oh, I'm sorry. So that is diversity. Were you invited to the dance? It's like a pretty easy way to think about it. Did you get to show up? Inclusion is, did anyone ask you to dance when you got there? It's all fun and games to go to the dance, but does it matter if you're there if you're having a miserable time? Wouldn't you rather be at home? So one thing about inclusion that I want to stress, that I actually got some feedback as this presentation was iterated on, is that being nice is not enough. There is a higher barrier to inclusion than being nice to people. We should be nice to people, but we should also be taking steps to understand their experiences, validate their experiences. We want them to understand that their needs are real. They don't have to be the same as mine, but I also understand what I feel like when my needs aren't being met, and I want to apply that empathy to that other person. So it's past being nice, and there's an action of empathy. There's empathy, there's thought, there's understanding, there's all kinds of things that go into inclusion other than just being nice to somebody. And so I break this out into what questions you'd ask in a situation or an interview where you are trying to increase your diversity, and then I break it out into questions you'd ask in an interview or think about if you were trying to increase inclusion. Now, mind you, these things should be connected, but I want to give a clear difference of the two. So a diversity mindset is thinking about things like pipeline. How can we get more diverse people into our pipeline? How can we incentivize recruiting diverse candidates? Sure. Why aren't people with marginalized identities applying for or being hired at our company? So these are diversity questions. These are questions when I'm thinking about those big slides we all sit through where they talk about the percentage of women, the percentage of men, and the percentage of people of color, the percentage of white people, and that's it. We're just talking about numbers here. But when we think about an inclusion mindset, we're starting to think about the experiences of people when they're at our company. We're starting to think about what are the experiences of people who consider themselves marginalized identities? What barriers stand in the way of those people feeling a sense of belonging? So what is stopping marginalized identities from feeling like they belong? And then what don't we realize? And this is the important one, and I'm super excited for Paloma to talk a little bit about this, but what don't we realize we're doing that is negatively impacting our teams, our employees, or our hiring process? What are those things we're not thinking about? Because it's hard to understand a marginalized identity. We're not getting to know those identities and those experiences and how that manifests on a team or in a company. So that's when we're talking about that inclusion mindset. And I love this because there's a positive correlation between inclusivity and every variable that influences our performance at work. So these are things like retention, engagement, reported happiness level. There's a positive correlation. It's almost incredible. People were given a list of 4 needs, which those exact needs are on my competence slide, but Paloma goes over a lot of our core needs. What really happens is once you start to hit 3 or 4 or 5 of those, employees report almost no difference in their happiness. It's the effort to meet even some of those needs, because it's a push-pull, it's reciprocal, right? So it's the effort our company is making to meet some of those needs that the employees meet in kind. That's the important part. So this is a reciprocal relationship. The company gives, and then I give. We're giving to each other. And so just note, this is like, I think this is amazing because it all lives in science, it all lives in data. And for me, this is a bold statement, but diversity requires inclusion. I just don't think you can have a diverse population, a diverse subset of people, without making sure that diverse set of people feels included. So it's interesting. There's a lot of really great research out there in the field of neuroscience and how our brains are pretty much social in nature, just purely social. It's really incredible. But going back to like early brain, is a sense of belonging is the primary threat for the human brain. Can we all agree on this? Early humans, our brains were trained to scan for threats constantly. Exclusion from a group was a death sentence. These are things that our brain, while we're now protected by cars and houses and cool jobs and giant buildings, these feelings have not gone away. These risks have not gone away. I think that's the important thing to remember about our brains and being at work, is that sense of belonging continues to threaten us today, just threatens us in different ways. But a sense of belonging is also the primary reward for the human brain. And in a lot of this research, there's such compelling evidence about how good belonging is for your soul, for your health, for everything. It impacts everything. And I saw some looks when I said it was the threat and the reward. These are two parallel systems, because if I don't belong, that is the biggest threat I can have in an environment. If I do belong, it is the biggest reward I can have in that environment and health-wise. I mean, they're finding out, like, this is incredible, but they're finding out people die from broken hearts. People die from being lonely. People die from being excluded from their groups, their tribes. This isn't ancient history. This is today. This is in a society where we have much less connection to each other. We have much less community. We move far away from our family and our tribes and our groups. So it really is a threat and a reward, because we're really trying to replicate that in everything we do. So we are a bunch of animals. And when I say this, it's referencing the fact that our brains don't necessarily work a whole lot differently now than it did our early ancestors. I think that's also really cool, because we have a lot to learn from history. We still enter the room scanning for threats. When we start a new job, we're scanning for threats. When we join a new team, we're scanning for threats. Basically, all of our systems of acceptance and rejection live in our social lives now. We don't really face that in terms of hunting and gathering or access to food. We face that in social situations. So taking all of that of our early ancestors and assessing threats, and now put that into us in a room with coworkers. That's basically what's happening. We're a bunch of animals in a room with coworkers. So like I said, most of the threats we encounter are now in social situations. So when we walk into a room, we're looking around and we're like, do I belong here? Can I eat that? Can that eat me? That's still happening. I hope no one at your job will eat you. But our brains are still processing that as if we are our early ancestors. It's pretty awesome. And so one of the main factors in how we process emotions is through the limbic system. So I'm going to tell you what happens when we perceive a threat. But I have to give you a little bit of vocab first. I also drew this brain. I'm like really proud of it, which means every time I give this talk, I have to compliment myself on my Adobe Sketch skills. So we have the limbic system. The limbic system controls emotions, arousal, and memories. So this is just to preface this for any neuroscientists who might be in the room, this is a very high level of what the limbic system does. And then we have our amygdala, which is right there in our limbic system, highlighted. And that determines threats, stores our fear memories, and interprets emotions. And this will all make sense in a minute. I know we just quickly went to brains. And then we have our prefrontal cortex, which controls decision-making, regulates emotions, and moderates our social behaviors. Has anyone ever heard of something called an amygdala hijack? Like a show of hands. It's like mostly people I've given this talk to before. Soon you will all know what an amygdala hijack is, and you'll use it gratuitously. So right here, I have what happens with a neurotypical brain. I want to be very conscious of the fact that this is a neurotypical brain and how a neurotypical brain would perceive sensory input. We have the sensory input. It goes to our amygdala, and we remember the amygdala is controlling our emotions, our fear memories. And it goes to our prefrontal cortex, which then processes what the appropriate output should be from this sensory input. And again, I use appropriate very loosely. Anything like normal, appropriate, very loosely. So this gives us our balanced response. But what happens, so this is just normal thought process, awesome. But what happens if we perceive a threat? An amygdala hijack. And so an amygdala hijack is when we bypass the prefrontal cortex. So where that reasoned balanced response would come from, We instead have an amygdala hijack. The amygdala just goes haywire and it produces that response. We just skip the balanced response entirely. Does anyone know how quickly this happens? It happens 400 times the speed of conscious thought. There are ways to head this off, but in the moment there is not. So this also results in a significant cognitive impairment, which is what I want to focus on too as I move past this. This causes the equivalent of a loss of 10 to 15 IQ points. It is also contagious. So I wonder if anyone's getting where I'm going with this. We have a threat at work. Right now, just totally random threat. But we have an amygdala hijack, and then we subsequently lose that 10 to 15 IQ points, the equivalent of that. And then we pass that along to everyone around us. And so we talked about at work, and I'll get into the amygdala hijack at work. But here's some things that can cause an amygdala hijack at work. Desk moves. Doesn't seem that big of a deal, does it? Team changes. Being interrupted in meetings. Negative or gendered feedback in reviews. Being routinely assigned tasks below your skill level. So this is just a very, very high level list of things that can give you an amygdala hijack at work. What's really funny is when I gave this at our conference, our chief product officer immediately stood up and just triggered everyone in the audience. And he was like, I guess that's an amygdala hijack because I saw all of you freak out and stop listening. That's an amygdala hijack. So I'm going to pick one up. This is based off a blog by someone named Laura Logan, so you can actually look up her more in-depth analysis of this. But desk moves. That doesn't seem like something that would trigger an amygdala hijack, does it? Like, you're just moving your desk, who cares? But what it doesn't take into account is the feeling you have while you're sitting in that desk with those people and where you're located. And so this is something that seems innocuous, but I've actually sat at six desks at New Relic in the last 3 years. It really does. It definitely triggers your day. It definitely triggers something. It definitely kind of ruins your day. You're no longer by the people you like. Maybe the group behind you is not the same anymore. Maybe you used to be outside of, your CEO's office. There we go. I was like, what's a C level? I can just. And then you're moved. Now you're by the bathroom and you hear the toilet flush all day, or you're by that person you don't like's office. This is actually something that will trigger an amygdala hijack in people. Team changes, kind of similar. You're used to your team, and then now there's a new person on the team, or someone has left the team. These things fundamentally change how you belong in that space, in that community. So just just kind of like think about some of these things and how you might react if they happen to you tomorrow. If you found out that 2 members of your team are gone, or 2 members of your team are gone and now you sit somewhere different, these things matter. How we make our employees feel matter. So like I said, an amygdala hijack causes cognitive impairment. This is significant because, I don't know if anyone knows this, but you can't actually multitask. That's a fallacy, it doesn't exist. You can context switch, but no one's very good at context switching. And so we work in an environment where context switching happens pretty constantly. And if we're triggered by an amygdala hijack, that's taking that. So they say context switching reduces your ability to focus on things by 50%. And now you have an amygdala hijack where now your IQ points are down an equivalent of 10 to 15 points. And so you can kind of see how this starts to have a larger effect on work. And what I'm really trying to drive home here is that nobody controls this. That's the thing, is when people don't feel a sense of belonging, in this case, that's the threat, this happens to them. Like, this is an actual response to a lack of inclusion, to not having your needs met, to not feeling like you belong. And when a sense of belonging is threatened, people tend to replicate that sense of belonging in other ways. So if you're on a team, this sometimes ends up being like an us versus them, or a group of people silo information to either protect themselves, to basically replicate a sense of control and belonging in the situation. So it's not necessarily a zero victim situation if people don't feel included in our teams or included in our company. There are actual negative effects that accompany not feeling like you belong. So outside of employee happiness, engagement, retention, you're also just, you're an uphill battle. So if I'm on a team where I don't feel like I belong and I find someone else who doesn't feel like they belong, now we have our own dynamic outside of the team dynamic. Does anyone experience this before, the us versus them on teams? It's awful. Everybody on the team feels that, not just the people in that argument, but everybody feels that on a team. And like I said before, this is really fascinating, but emotions are contagious, with negative emotions being the most contagious. And there's a really cool study that was done where they told someone to feel something. They told a man to feel emotion that made him, or think of a memory that made him feel extremely sad, just like brutally sad. And then they sat him in a room with 10 other people who didn't know what he was thinking and they didn't speak. But by the end of the experiment, they all felt sad. Your emotions are contagious without speaking. And another fun fact for you is that the perceived leader in the room is the person who sets the emotional tone. So not necessarily the person with the highest title. So it's not necessarily the VP or the director. It's the person who is perceived as having the most control, the most leadership roles. Think about whether you want that person defining the emotional tone of your meetings, because that's the person who is. But what can we do? So I'm telling you what happens if you don't feel like you belong. There's the amygdala hijack, not good for you. It's not good for your teams. We can probably all agree on that. But we also have a way to feel better, to feel inclusive, to make ourselves feel better. We have a way to negate this. When we talk about negative feelings and emotions, our brain activity actually moves back to the prefrontal cortex. This was a study done by someone who basically just had people sit in an MRI machine and talk about their feelings when they got triggered. And they could actually watch the brain activity move back to the prefrontal cortex, which then started having that emotional output we were talking about, that actual normal response. We can talk about our feelings and emotions, but what I'm really trying to get at here is that there is an actual response to not feeling like you belong. It's a brain response. When someone feels upset because they don't belong, it's not because they're a weak person or they need to buck up. It's because our brains control this. Our brains want to belong. I encourage you to do just any sort of Googling or research on this. I have a source slide. It's so fascinating what they find out about our brains. Because we can also challenge and change our preconceived notions. I'm sure all of you have heard of unconscious bias. This is not an unconscious bias talk. You're welcome. But everybody has them. Our brains are just built that way. So to circumvent making people feel excluded, to increasing inclusion in our companies, that has to be an actual effort. It can't just happen. But we can rewire our brains. There used to be sort of a school of thought that we were done developing at 25. They've just totally blown that out of the water. You can continue to iterate and learn and build new neural pathways through experiencing other people. And neuroscience actually shows that we can intentionally influence our brains to be more inclusive. It's challenging stereotypes. It's challenging our first thought and getting to the second thought. What is really right here? Sorry, just had like a moment. But no, it shows that we can, like, there's many studies that show, which I have linked here, that show people become more inclusive once they're exposed to more groups. And that's really it, is making that emotional connection, making that real effort to understand other people's experiences in the workplace, in your community, in your families. And we can actually start to retrain our brains, but it takes effort. It's not just something that's going to happen, like I want to be more inclusive, so I am. But the road to true diversity and inclusion intersects with empathy. So like I said at the beginning, being nice is not enough. You have to be empathetic. It's an action. It's a reciprocal action. So just remember that, like, being nice to your new coworker isn't the same as asking your new coworker out to lunch. Isn't the same as asking where they came from, asking where they want to go. Being nice is not enough. You can be nice to any number of people from any number of marginalized groups, and that's not going to feel like inclusion. And a lack of inclusion really does hurt us all. It is links to depression, heart disease. Loneliness can kill you. we want to really make an effort to not only find groups for ourselves, but find groups for others. I think we owe it to each other in a community. We owe it to each other as human beings to create places where people feel welcome, to take that little bit of action, that little bit more, to make people feel like they belong. And so I found this quote today, actually. It was not in here before today, but I really thought this was amazing. Does anyone know who E.O. Wilson is? He's this guy. Woohoo! But anyway, he's done a lot of studies on secular humanism, sociobiology. He's really awesome. And so the quote is, "To be kept in solitude is to be kept in pain and put on the road to madness. A person's membership in his group, his tribe, is a large part of his identity." So thinking, if I talk to you about identity, we'd be here all night. But just remember how being parts of groups, being parts of teams, being part of an inclusive company, an inclusive environment, is part of our identities. So this is a giant source slide, if anyone wants to take care of a picture of it. But I am done, and I would like to introduce Paloma to talk to you a little bit about how some of these things can be put into practice in hiring. So thank you so much. Sorry for not having you. Oh, that was terrible.
Hi, y'all. So while we're switching over, I'll introduce myself. My name is Paloma Medina, and I have been working, I started off in performance improvement coaching in homeless healthcare, actually just down the street at Outside In clinic. Who knows Outside In? It's so great there. That was a long time ago. So I became really obsessed with performance improvement. I became a coach for teams doing performance improvement, and then I learned a bunch of psychology and neuroscience. And all of a sudden, my teams that were doing good, all of a sudden my teams were doing amazing once I started applying, because as it turns out, knowing about brains is pretty helpful. So fast forward to where I am now. I've been obsessed with equity and diversity, the psychology and neuroscience of the two things where they intersect, which is kind of how I got to know Rachel. And so I'm going to just be diving into tactics because Rachel did a really great job of kind of laying the foundation around what's happening in brains. And she mentioned prefrontal cortex. I'm going to refer to it as the PFC. So remember PFC. And the limbic system, we're going to refer to both of those. And I want to do a really quick thing here, which is talk about why change how we hire. If you're here, I just made a very massive assumption, which I can be wrong about, which is that you already know that you want to change how you hire. You're just curious how to change how you hire. But I also know that one of the things I do is one-on-one coaching. And a major question, a very common question that I get asked by team leaders and hiring managers is, how can I convince my team? So we're going to kind of talk about both of those because I know that that's one of the conversations that you have a lot. And so I'm going to go really quickly through two major factors that when we think about what's impacting diversity and equity in hiring, one of the factors that I often hear talked about again and again and again is the talent pool and talent scarcity, which I'm just going to tell you I just ignore. I just ignore it. I've done this work in New York. I've done the work in San Francisco, in LA, and now in Portland. And everyone has the same question, like, oh, but the talent pool. If we are tapping at the outmost, the talent pool, meaning let's say that, 20% of degrees are going to women. Most companies aren't at 20%. So first of all, we're not even reaching the talent pool. And second of all, there's blind resume studies. Blind resume studies. Some of you already know these. And one of my, the more recent ones that I've been looking at that has been duplicated, so it's pretty solid. There's a few companies that have done this that are actually private companies. Some of them are recruiting firms, and some of them are companies that are trying to solve the problem through new apps. And what they have found, this is in the tech field specifically, and it's in the past 4-ish years, so it's pretty recent. When 5,000 resumes were sent out to recruiters and companies and individual hiring managers and companies in the tech field, and the names were visible, so you can tell gender, 5% of the candidates that were chosen to go onto the interview stage were women. When they removed names and any kind of gender information that could be found on the resume, all of a sudden, This jumps to 54% of candidates chosen to go on to the interview choose are women. I kind of saw where I was going, I think. That one, right? They've done this around race. They've done this around age. It just keeps happening. We're still there. And so I'm happy to talk about talent scarcity and that, but I should change that. I don't actually want to talk about it. Talk to someone else. Lots of people I've learned want to talk about it. So you've got, there's got folks options. I want to talk about unconscious biases because we could talk about the talent pool all day, and it's really hard to change the talent pool very quickly, right? There's people working in the STEM education world. They're doing really awesome work in that. But what can we do now? All the tactics that I will be covering, you could probably do or convince one or two people to do with you, and then you will have impact, which is cool. So unconscious biases, one way of thinking about them is that candidates that have been through some of these studies hired by a computer algorithm, just a computer, fed resumes, turned into data, the computer says, you should pick this person. They were 50% more likely to be successful in their roles 2 years later than ones that were done through recruiters. Now, this is not the slide where I trash talk recruiters. I know that you're in the back. What I loved is that they chose recruiters because they were like, these are the most competent, trained people in hiring, right? And they're still open to unconscious biases, more so than a computer. So that's kind of the metaphor that I've been thinking that I started using a while back. That's how I kind of get centered around what we're talking about and what I mean by unconscious biases in hiring. So raise your hand if you use Spotify, just so I know. Okay, everyone uses Spotify. Raise your hand if you love your Discover Weekly playlist. I love it. There's like 4 people. They're like, eh. So remember when it first came out? So Spotify is a cloud streaming music service, and when Discover Weekly as a feature came out a few years ago, everybody was like, oh my God, Discover Weekly is the most amazing feature ever. And then it started getting weird, right? So I found out what people were complaining about. I was like, wow, this is an amazing feature. I love it. I don't know what you're complaining about. And then last winter, y'all who were here might remember what that was like. Maybe I might have been, I don't know, listening to a lot of Iron and Wine. It was a long, dark winter. And it seems like the Discover Weekly kind of picked up on this algorithm. They were using their algorithms being like, whoa, she's in a dark place, Iron and Wine, let's give her more. And Discover Weekly for months. So if you know Iron and Wine, how would you describe that music? Melancholy, dark, acoustic. Real Northwesty. And I was, and then like spring came and I was like, what's up? Let's do some new stuff. Nope. No matter what I listened to on my own, no matter what new playlist I created, the invisible algorithm that Spotify was using kept giving me the same Discover. And I complained to everyone. They're like, yeah, whatever. And I was like, no, this is infuriating. And then someone said, you could just do it the regular way that we used to, back in my day. And I was like, oh yeah, I could just do intentional maneuvers, right? So I could rely on their invisible algorithms, or I could do intentional maneuvers. And so I did, other fun stuff, like I would just look up random keywords in the search box, up in the search box, just look it up, and then like find a user, and then look at their playlist and be like, whoa, what's this? And that way, right? Like mixtapes almost, right? Okay. And that's how I got back into like a rail. So I found Big Frida. How similar, those of you who know Big Frida, how similar do you think it is to like melancholy, dark, acoustic, soft whispering music? Pretty similar. If you haven't listened to Big Frida, I recommend you do that on the way home. It'll make your night really great. So intentional maneuvers got me Big Frida. The invisible algorithm got me Iron and Wine. As different as these two artists are, and as different as their subcultures are, they both very much align with my life and my values. They both do. But I wasn't ever going to get to Big Frida using the invisible algorithms. And that's when we think about it, that's kind of what Harvard and MIT recently released, recently I think it was 2 years ago, released these numbers that they had 18% of the female computer science degrees in 2013 were going to women. And they did intentional maneuvers that were actually very, I've read about the studies and what they did. It's very doable. It didn't cost like Harvard money. You know, it's actually very doable what they changed. And they got it up to 35 to 50% of computer science degrees being awarded to women by 2015. What? Intentional maneuvers. So that's what I want to talk about. Versus, I know that Brigham Young and PSU on that list of computer science degrees going to women lists, they're at the lowest. And when I read about the things that they're doing a ton, you know? So what's possible doesn't necessarily have to cost money, and that's what I'm going to talk about. Because I want our goal to be not how, so one of the questions I'm asked often is, hey, can you help us hire more people of color? Or can you help us hire more women in tech? Or can you help us hire more? And then I'm always like, no, I'm sorry, but I can't, because people aren't truffles. Like, and I know that by the way, that I say this because I used to be like, hey, when I used to work at Outside In, I was like, hey, how do we hire more Latino workers when a huge percentage of our clients are Latino? So shouldn't we have more Latino workers? So I was asking the same question. It's not a bad question. It's just that that's not what I do. So just kind of a caveat. Because I do think, kind of like what Rachel was saying, we've gotten a little bit over-focused on like truffles. Like, can I find a Black, queer, trans, Jewish engineer, a founder, and I get like a big prize. So people don't want to be treated like truffles because they're not. So I am interested in what are the tactics that maneuver around our homogeneous algorithms, the invisible ones, right? How do we maneuver around them? Knowing that we kind of that's actually what we have to do because the limbic system is so strong. I'll go into that a little bit. So that we treat all candidates equally every step of the hiring process. That's the goal. How do we maneuver around homogeneous algorithms so that we treat all candidates equally every step of the way? That's the thing. Okay, so we're gonna do. So that said, we're gonna do that. We're gonna go through the sourcing, one tactic for sourcing, two for screening, and one for deciding. I'm gonna go really fast. And so now I think we can pass out the worksheets. I encourage you to, you have them, done. Thank you. There you go, grab them. We're gonna skip the first exercise. At the end, if we have time, I'll go into it, but I kind of wanna get straight to the tactics. So what are the intentional maneuvers? So sourcing. One of the questions that people ask me often is, what conferences should we go to? What colleges should we be recruiting at? Are there some big events that we can send our recruiters to? And I'm like, whoa, let's zoom out. Let's zoom out a lot first. And tell me more about your value proposition. What's your value proposition that you put forward to candidates? So many people just are like, look at me blankly. They're like, what? What do you mean by that? And I'm like, what do you call it? What do you think candidates think is the best thing about working for you? For your team, right? Or for your larger company, either. But people are like, ooh, so they kind of go through a list, financial perks, work environment. Yeah, we talk about this or that. You can look at people's websites, right? Their careers websites. And there's everything from, dogs. That was just my attempt to give you a little oxytocin, by the way. It's like, so like dogs in the workplace, we're so casual, we're so laid back. Nitro cold brew on tap. Like, free lunch, awesome. So we talk, I see a lot of these still on career pages, and they're not bad, by the way, but you should know that, right? They are part of your value proposition that you're putting out there. And so the real question that I want to ask people is, how might we build on our value proposition, the current one that you're using, build on it so that we offer value to a diversity of genders, races, ethnicities, religions, physical and mental abilities, all the subcultures, right? What's the story we're telling? And so I want you to, perfect. This is kind of some of the core motivators that Rachel was talking about. There's something called biceps. I came up with the acronym because biceps are pretty great. I came up with it, but it is based on the work of many, many, many people, and this one's just not trademarked, so I can use it. But there's many other acronyms that are trademarked that I can't use. But the work is not mine. The research behind how these are core motivators, how they're essentially core threats / rewards for the brain is there. It's not my work. It's other people's work. I just made the fun little acronym. So when people get stuck and they're like, oh, how do we build on our value proposition is hard because we have our own blind spots. I'm going to talk about what I love about our company, but that's talking to other people who love the same stuff I love about our company. And so you'll hit a very natural blind spot there. So one of the things you can do, there's two things you can do when you're considering this, is these are demographically neutral, meaning belonging, improvement, choice, autonomy, same thing, equity, predictability, and status. So I want you to grab your worksheet, and I want you to read the examples. This versus me like going over them. I think they're kind of helpful to just read on your own. I'm going to give you a second. Okay. So what I often ask people then instead is, what are the things, when you think about these 6 core motivators, what are some of the things that your work environment is maybe already offering that you're not highlighting that is actually attractive to many types of people, not just the current ones that the pattern that you're currently hiring, and or maybe there's some that you're working towards. So for humans, choice is a really, 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 really core motivator. Choice, people when they are moved from an environment where they had a relatively normal level of choice and then moved into an environment where they have an incredibly low level of choice, such as nursing homes, especially old school nursing homes in the 80s when these studies were done, what they found is that all of their health metrics declined. So we know it matters to people. And many of you actually have a ton of choice built into the roles, into your work environment. So one of the clients that I was working with did a survey, 3-question survey, to kind of get a sense of maybe how to improve or evolve their value proposition in recruiting and hiring. And they asked people, what is a thing that you love about working here that you'd want to make sure we never got rid of? And why does it matter to you? One of the questions. And what they got was a really big, huge theme was how much people loved remote working, that they could work from home or work remotely on average of 1 day a week. And it was no reason needed to be given. It was just part of the culture that everyone valued working remotely or working from home at least once a week. And when the key thing was one they were not mentioning this in any of their career recruiting, sourcing, anything materials. But the real lovely part of the data was people saying why they valued that. They got answers, really interesting answers, like one person said, I have Crohn's disease and I don't have to tell any of my coworkers about my health status ever, how I'm doing, because it's just as normal for them to work from home some days as it is for me. I might do it because it's really flaring up and it hurts to move. But I don't have to tell coworkers, I don't need to tell that how many of those I'm actually using for health purposes. Someone else mentioned, I actually never mentioned during during the hiring process that I have a very, very young child at home, and I didn't feel safe to do so because I didn't want people to think that I wasn't going to be as dedicated, all that stuff. And one of the reasons I chose your company is because I knew that if my kid was sick, I didn't have to worry about it. I could take that, I could figure it out, and it wouldn't count against me. And like they just had story after story. And they were like, okay, wow, it's not just a thing that people value that we're not talking to potential candidates about. It's also a thing that we didn't realize actually is so inclusive about us, which is cool. So that said, I also want to highlight equity. Equity, equality is, if you ever want to Google monkey equality study, I think that's the perfect keywords for that one. I don't think you'll get anything weird. There's these really amazing videos showing how monkeys completely freak out if they sense inequality among the monkeys, like how you're treating the monkey. And you'll watch it, and if any of you have a 2-year-old or have had a 2-year-old, you're like, oh my God, that's what's happening. And also, if you've ever been on an airplane and someone takes up more of the, like any tiny situation of inequality, you know how amygdala hijacking it can be if things aren't fair. And so it's not surprising that 67% in a recent study, my sources are on my website, but now I forget who. 67% of job seekers said that they look for evidence of diversity and equity when considering if to apply, and obviously if to accept a job offer from a company. 67% currently in the tech world. So it makes sense because humans care about equity, but it means that there's a really hard truth, which is that if you haven't crunched your compensation equity, your promotion equity, your retention equity, your employment engagement, happiness numbers, and seeing if there's any key demographics where maybe that data is skewed, if you're not crunching those, just know that you may not be super sure about, once you hire them, what kind of habitat you are creating that you're actually hiring them into, right? Which is kind of what Rachel was talking about. These numbers, I've heard every reason why people can't get compensation equity numbers, check their promotion equity. Is their promotion, being equitably done? Retention rates, are you hemorrhaging a particular demographic of employee engagement? Are some employees, a specific group of them, incredibly unhappy year after year? I've heard lots of excuses. I just said excuses. I meant to say reasons. I've heard lots of reasons. I used to work for HR. I know that it's a can of worms legally. I understand it. And still, there's tons of people come talk to me afterwards. If you're like, we're ready to take the dive, we want someone to kind of walk us through it. I don't do that work. Lots of colleagues do that work to walk you through how to get these numbers. Because if you're not getting them, you don't know. And people are booking tours on Mars, right? That's happening right now in the world. And so I think we can get those. I think we can get these. And I know it's hard. And I've worked in HR. I know it's hard. And it's totally possible. And I've gone through 2 companies now that did really intense audits, essentially, into this. So, yay. Okay. So building a more inclusive value proposition, the worksheet's there for you. Start with biceps. Go through and be like, what are all the different things? Belonging. Are we already offering these? Can we talk more about them? Not just the ones we love that who we currently are. So let's talk about screening. We're going to talk about 2 tactics in this one. Actually, let me go back. By screening, I mean when you first get a batch of resumes and you start going through them, all the way to when you do your last interview. That's what I categorize as a screening phase, right? You're screening candidates throughout it. So I'll let you read this one. So what the studies show, what this means is that if you start with job success criteria, and the job success criteria is essentially first, you need to know this position, we plan for it, we want for it to accomplish certain things in a year. What are those things? And you list them out. And then you reverse engineer, well, what skills, qualifications will the person need to have to accomplish those things in their first year? That's job success criteria. When you use those from the very beginning, before you even get the first resume, all the way to the last interview, that massively decreases the bias. Anyone know, any guesses why having this job success criteria does this? When Rachel talked about the prefrontal cortex, the PFC, actually, let me just show you this. What we find is that if you reverse engineer the position will accomplish the following in the following year, and then what skills are required, you decrease blurry criteria. So first, go ahead and look at your worksheet, because I have a really quick graph that you can duplicate for your own hiring workflows. Under screening, you'll see the first number 1, defining success. So read that one over. So this is an example I did with a team maybe 2 years ago. So I said, okay, so what are the things that this position will accomplish in a year? And the first thing they said is we're really hoping that they're going to help us build a a new system for how to prioritize tickets, and they'll have to collaborate with multiple teams who use this ticketing system. And so prioritizing their tickets. And so we have to do that. We don't want to use the off-the-shelf stuff. This person's going to have to build it. So I was like, okay. And then you go to number 2, which is reverse engineering it. I break it up into interpersonal skills, hard skills, values, and culture-forward qualities. By the way, I don't call them soft skills because they're the hardest to teach. So that's weird. They're interpersonal skills. They're so hard to teach. So definitely make sure that you're thinking about what interpersonal skills you want the person to come bring with them already versus which ones you're happy to teach them. So interpersonal, they said, okay, if they're going to have to do this big cross-team project about how we prioritize tickets, they need to have a pleasant and efficient negotiation skill set when dealing with other teams. They've had people in that role that were very pleasant but took years to negotiate with other teams. And they've had people that were really intense and aggressive in negotiation. They're like, we want someone that balances these two. And I was like, awesome. It's a really great interpersonal one. And they kept going. Hard skills, culture forward. Anyone know if we call it culture forward, not culture fit? Those of you are savvy. Culture fit's who you already have. It's fitting your past. Culture forward reminds you, your hiring team, your recruiters, yourself, that you probably are hiring for your future company, right? And your future culture. And all company cultures evolve. So it's nice to be intentional about, is this person going to help you evolve your culture to the future culture you want? Kind of cool. Versus who you used to be, because then you'll only do culture fit, you'll keep getting the same kind of folks. So decreasing blurry criteria, when I walk people through this reverse engineering, start with the job success list, reverse engineer the skills that were required for them, all of a sudden, blurry criteria fall by the wayside. And here's my favorite example of blurry criteria. They're just fun to get a beer with. And I know some of you are like, that is my hardcore number 1 criteria. I will not leave that. This is the best criteria ever. I first started doing this when I was hiring for Outside In, again, a long, long time ago, where I was really, really new to it. And I used to have that they felt comfortable to get drinks with and have real talk with at the bar. I think some version of that in my head. And that's kind of how we talked about it. And then later I learned that that is classic example of bias porous criteria. Criteria that you've come up with that is just like all the bias, all of it, yes, I'm going to yes, homogeny, yes. We don't mean for that, right? We don't mean for that. But it's not job specific. Can the person, actually, if you just look at your worksheet, right? For them to launch a cross-team project to improve how we prioritize tickets, do they need to be fun while having beers? No. And in fact, when I was reverse engineering this and doing it again and again, never did that come up. And I was like, I really wanted it to at some point be relevant to clinic, homeless healthcare clinic work. It never was. It never was. So start with clear job success criteria. These things, after the lecture, I highly recommend that you try it on your own when it's fresh to do that reverse engineering. It's also one of the most efficient ways that I have found. Really, it's so fast to create job descriptions, to give everything that I need to give to recruiters. It's so much faster this way. When to use it, you use it during the job description, when you're writing the job ad, every screening step, resume reviews, phone screens, portfolio reviews, whatever you do, tests, and of course, interviews. And we'll talk a little bit about how to use that through that. So, the second tactic I want to talk about is something called structured interviewing. There's 3 main components to structured interviewing. And the first one I have found more and more folks in tech already know about and already using, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. It's behavioral questions. Behavioral questions look like this. I'll let you read them. You'll notice that there's a common thread in behavioral questions. They ask always about the past. Tell me about a time when. They have been shown to continue to have 50% predictability, which is the highest predictability rate of any kind of question you can ask in an interview or phone screening, the highest, which is, again, computer algorithms, humans. 50% kind of is the best that we can do. But versus 10% for hypotheticals, for describe yourself questions. So hypotheticals are things like, if a bear walked in a room, what would you do? Or what's a more realistic one? If a customer was irate and wanted to talk to the manager, what would you do? That's a hypothetical. Describe yourself is, tell me what kind of salesperson you are. That's a describe yourself. Those have 10% at best predictability of actually predicting what this person will do in their future role. Behavioral questions are really great. What's really lovely about them is that you can steal them. There's so many on the internet. There's so many on my website and links and resources. I have some links there to my favorites. Also, they're really easy to create your own. So if you look again at your worksheet, my favorite thing, again, about this process is that it's made me much more efficient of a recruiter, because you can look at your first criteria, and all you have to do is say, tell me about a time when, and then fill it in with the criteria. That's it. So tell me about a time when you had to negotiate efficiently, but really like calmly with another team. Done. Behavioral question, gold star, done. You can do the same thing. Tell me about a time when you built something from scratch with Python. Tell me about a time when you mentored others in using Python. Done. Behavioral question. So if you have questions about those, feel free to find me afterwards. There are some really good resources out there already for them, or make your own. The second component of structured interviewing is being consistent in questions, meaning once you have a list of your criteria, and now you have a list of your questions, you ask every candidate the same exact list of questions. Every candidate, the same exact list of questions. And this is the closest that we can be to those computer algorithms, right? And so one of the things that's really hard of convincing people is that in-group candidates, what we see is that they get softer questions, like soft pitch questions, and they also get less follow-up questions because of something called in-group glow, or in-group candidate glow. So if, when I was hiring at Outside In, I first started doing this and learning about in-group candidate glow, my pattern of hiring was ladies in their 20s and 30s who were white and liberal. I had that hiring pattern. And I was hiring for social work kind of positions. I was like, I don't know why, the talent pool, all the PSU social work graduates are all pretty much, like I had all that stuff. But I kept hiring them. I was like, okay, what's going on? And one of the things I noticed is that I noticed that it was true as soon as a lady in her 20s and 30s who was white and in any way seemed to signal that she was liberal, walked in the room as a candidate. I was just like there was, no one's going to admit this. I'm up here, so I'm admitting it. But we know that from research that people do it. And what it means is, so let's say I ask her, tell me about your last job. And she's like, here's my last job. And she gives me a question. What research would show that I was doing, and I probably was being like, that's a great answer. Next question. If someone that was the opposite of that came in and I was interviewing them, research would show that I'd be like, tell me about the last job you had. And then they would give me an answer and I'd be like, I don't know if that was a complete answer. I would just be harder on them. We do it all the time. And so the consistency in questions is extra helpful, well, to make sure that you're doing them if you're interviewing in strategic pairs. So by strategic, I mean, one, always interview another interviewer. So you, another interviewer, and a person. I highly, highly, highly recommend this. It will mean that your interviewing is more structured because you kind of are now accountable to each other, like what happens in the room doesn't stay in the room. So I've noticed interviewers just get a lot more like hardcore and really, they stick to the questions like we said we would. And what I love about them, and by strategic, I do mean strategic in 3 different ways. Interview pairs are really lovely because it means you can pair a really highly successful recruiter or interviewer, someone who really gets you amazing, equitable, diverse candidates, right? Pair them with someone more junior so they get to watch them. That was the best way for me to learn. 2, you get richer data. Laura Hogan, who you mentioned, she has a really great story about when she was hiring, that they started hiring in female, she's in tech, and they started hiring in male-female interview pairs. And there was 2 candidates in a batch of 6, 2 of the 6 that would not make eye contact with her. but was very good at making eye contact with her male pair. One of them, of the two, when she would ask a question, the candidate would answer her male colleague. When the male colleague would ask a question, he would answer his male colleague. Like she was kind of just watching a ping pong match. She was like, okay, that is data. That's rich data. You don't have to do anything with the data, but it's good to have. Right? It's up to you what to do with that data. And three, I have found that it can create an equally good candidate experience. People are like, ooh, that seems really intense, the 2-in-1, we've done the research. The candidate doesn't have to be intimidated because one of the things you can do is essentially now take turns asking questions, which is nice. It means you're more relaxed because your brain gets a chance to catch up, right, from the last question, which is nice, which means you're relaxed, they're relaxed, your blood pressure goes down, their blood pressure goes down, by the way. Vice versa, right? You have more control in that situation. Your stakes are a little lower than theirs are in that moment. And two, you can banter really calmly. You can answer questions a little bit more richly for the candidate. And you're probably giving them better data about your company without having to do another interview, right? So there's ways to do it. The big thing that I have found fascinating about structured interviewing is that for the past 20 years, we have known that unstructured interviewing is the least effective way to interview. 20 years. And this still seems to be true. So when people were in hiring teams were asked, what do you think is the most effective methodology for hiring? There's unstructured interview, specific aptitude tests, personality tests like a Myers-Briggs, something called a GMI test, which is really specific in this case to the role that they were studying for. And they were like, unstructured interview, we're just kind of flowing with the candidate. You know, you're just kind of getting to know them. Maybe we go out for drinks or for coffee. They're talking about that. Okay, that's what we think it is. This is what it actually is. Still, it is, in fact, has the lowest success rate. So the last thing that most people are like worried about with structured interviewing is it kind of just turn you into a robot. It's not very human friendly versus just kind of getting, taking the person out for coffee and just chit-chatting with them. I would say anything that levels the playing field for all candidates, despite our own homogeneous algorithms, is more human friendly. Whatever does that is the most human friendly. So it might take skill for you as the hiring, the one in that seat, to kind of get used to asking the same questions again and again and again and again and finding your own rhythm to it, right? And finding your own natural tone. But I know it's possible. Tons of you already do it. So you can attest that this is totally possible to ask the same questions. And just know that you're going to get so much more interesting data, which is itself kind of great for your brain, because now you're comparing apples to apples. Right? You're asking the same questions, so you're getting actual comparable data, which is cool. So there are ways to do it and still be very, very human and candidate friendly, which is cool. Structured interviewing. Okay, last one. Doing good. Okay, deciding. In the deciding phase, use written feedback, by which, let me pause there. In deciding, the deciding phase is when you've done all of your interviewing, all of your phone screening, you've looked at all the resumes, and now you and your hiring team, and maybe just you and another person, maybe just you, maybe you and your recruiters, right? You all huddle and debrief and say, okay, we got a decision to make, which one we're going to choose. That's the deciding phase. Use written feedback, by which I mean if the person, let's say that you have a hiring team that's helping you with 3 folks that interviewed and you are the actual decision maker. Don't debrief with them and huddle with them afterwards and be like, what'd you think? Have them write it down. Be like, hey, after you're done with the interview, here's a little form. I actually make a form for them that looks like this. Here's the criteria that we're doing. These are the interview pairs, Sarah and Jim. They're going to be asking questions for criteria 1 and criteria 3. Clark and Lee are going to be asking for these criteria, and these folks are going to be, so everyone knows essentially who's where, like on what base. Everyone knows who's on what base. And then I give them a list of questions, choose from these questions, but then be consistent. I tell all of them that. The criteria, right, looks kind of something like this, so that people know what they're doing. Research shows that when you ask people in interviews, either during the interview or after the interview, to write their feedback about the candidate, their PFC is more engaged. Sometimes, depending on the study, it's a little preliminary, but by a factor of 30. And from Rachel, the PFC is the rational, non-bias prone part of the brain. all just rational. Not looking for in-group, out-group status, none of that stuff. And so just the act of writing the feedback keeps us accountable to the things that we mean to hire, which is this. I also love using some kind of cheat sheet where they have to write stuff down. This is what this actually looks like in real life for me is an Google spreadsheet. And I say, hey, when you're done, put all your notes in the actual cell. We'll debrief against them at the meeting. Make sure you have them by the huddle meeting. So that's our process. But what I love is that then during the huddle, the debrief, when I hear something like, I don't know, I just didn't like their vibe. By the way, 10 years ago, I'd be like, yeah, I don't know, me neither. I don't know, me too, never mind, scrap that one, next. And now I know, oh, okay, that doesn't, one, match any of the criteria. I can't tell if it does. So what's really nice about having both written feedback from the interviewer as well as for yourself in the debrief is you can then ask follow-up questions to actually get data about the criteria. So these are two of the common ones I ask. Okay, cool. Oh, so you didn't like the vibe. Did they do or say something that kind of felt different? Or is there a particular criteria you were asking about where you felt that vibe change? Sometimes people will be like, I don't know, I just didn't like them. And you're like, I personally am like, that's not data. Mold it over. See if there's something that kind of, from your memory that you can remember about that. It's not, I just don't know what to do that. Because by the way, in my field of work, I didn't like their vibe. It's very it's like bias, by which I mean in-group bias versus out-group bias. It's not that they hate the person, it's just that they categorize them as out-group or pattern. They didn't match the pattern what they were looking for in the role. So we don't know what to do with it. We can't use it because we're really hardcore when we do our research. Okay. But what's really nice is there are many times when I've asked follow-up questions from what seemed like very blurry feedback. And when I said, okay, so what was the thing they said or did that kind of gave you that weird vibe? And there are times people have said, you know what? They never made eye contact with me. So the criteria I think I'm thinking about is like, I don't know that I could negotiate and want to get to a win-win situation with this person if they don't even know how to make eye contact with me when they're nervous. And I was like, yes, that is really, yeah, that's interesting. And I would ask other people, did anyone else notice this person not being good at eye contact? And lo and behold, the folks that looked just like the candidate were like, made great eye contact. I was like, okay, so this person might still be working through their in-group, out-group behavior bias stuff. And yeah, that is good data. Thank you. So that we're going to put that under collaborative negotiating skills. Definitely need to be good at really nice trust building, eye contact. So it's not that it's bad, it's that you need more data. Okay. I want to give one last caveat. These are really quick tactics. It's why I wanted to give you the worksheet so you have them on my website, palomamedina.com. There's tons of more resources. Everything that I talked about, the studies, they're all on there. But I want to kind of give a quick something I didn't used to mention in these trainings, and is actually where things get hard for people in changing, is that there's a real fear our brain faces when we start drastically changing our hiring tactics, which is that our limbic system has presumed that if we currently like our team and who we're hiring, or like our culture or team culture, company culture, it must be something that we're doing in the past that got us there. And so there's this kind of unspoken thing. So I already told you that when I thought about my current hiring pattern, at the top of your worksheet are these questions. I recommend you try them out and see what answers. I find them to be very private answers. I don't know that you have to discuss them with your team. Awesome if you do. I did eventually. But when I first started doing this, I was like, do I have a hiring pattern currently? And it was this. So I was like, okay, I'm not going to say that aloud to anyone, but I have noticed that about who I hire. By the way, I'm still fighting this 10 years later. I'm getting way better at it. What does my subconscious think this pattern will guarantee? Again, just real truth talk with yourself. No one has to know. But what I realized is I think I attribute empathy, good listening skills, and good at collaboration with this demographic. I wouldn't ever say it out loud, but some part of the back of my mind kind of feels that way. And so I feel trust when one of these walks in the room and I'm interviewing. And so then the reverse thing from a psychology perspective is to say, okay, who are people who have those qualities that you currently have in your life that you can think of that don't fit your current hiring pattern? And then, of course, now my PFC turns on and is like, Roy, Carlos is amazing, Obama. I mean, like the list goes on and on. When Rachel talked about essentially neuroplasticity, changing our brains, individuation is one of these practices. It's what we're doing here. It's kind of part of the work. Changing your hiring tactics is very important, but just know at some point you need to convince your brain that your old hiring patterns are not guaranteeing you good stuff, and that you, in fact, have lots of evidence of the opposite. And I say that because with teams, you may have to also convince your teams about their unspoken fears. The unspoken fears are like, aren't we going to lose what we have if we kind of break our current hiring pattern? You all know this, especially those of you who have tried really hard changing your teams, right? You've told it to me in one-on-one conversations, but you know that your teams will never say this outright. You just can tell that resistance. And so you're right. You might have to change, like put in a new question for them in their brain, which is how might we? Like, what are the things we might gain if we break our old recruiting pattern? Like, what if you could hire Obama? Like, because to me, when I thought of Roy and Carlos, I was like, oh my God, I'm so glad we hired them. And I didn't hire them. So I'm glad someone else there had better algorithms going on. And since then, that's why I work to do this work, because I know that changing the tactics can maneuver around them. So I'm going to pause, done. You still should only try one or two at a time first. I mean, yeah, that's kind of how change management works. So feel free to consider which one. You have your worksheet, Q&A. Do we do it?
Let's do it.
Thanks, y'all.
All right, I'm going to give Rachel a second to grab her mic. And Hannah will be on that side of the room, and I'm over here. If you want to raise your hand if you have a question for either Paloma or Rachel.
Oh, we're going to stay in.
They're going to stand.
I think otherwise we might go back.
Questions?
I'm in.
I'll ask the first question while people are warming up. When you're talking about debriefing, do you recommend that teams always do a group debrief, or do you think is bias more common when people debrief one-on-one with the hiring manager, or when you make everyone who is involved in the hiring or in the interviews sit around a table together to debrief?
There isn't very solid hardcore data on that, but based on other ethics data we have on humans, which we have a ton of ethics data on humans and groups, we know that teams of six or groups of six or less, a conversation of about six or less is actually increases accountability as long as the hiring lead, whoever's the most influential in the room, is setting the tone of equity first. So as long as that's there, which I'm presuming it is because you're moving in that direction, and it's about a group of six or less, yes, have it in a group setting, because accountability towards those kinds of ethics and equity will go up. You'll kind of feel the pressure of being good people in front of each other. Which is great.
Hi, so first off, I want to say great talk. Thank you very much for all the actionable stuff. It's a total gold mine for that. So as someone who is trying to get themselves into a point where they will be hiring someday, well, that will be kind of part of my day-to-day.
Yeah.
What do you point people to when they don't necessarily have the data or the history or I've been doing this for 10 years and here's my biases that I've examined? Sort of how do you start in a vacuum, I guess? What are some of your resources you'd recommend?
I mean, by the way, it's kind of lovely to start from scratch now versus if you're like one of us that was doing it all wrong for 20 years and then had to unlearn and be convinced by incredibly genius people that you're doing it wrong. and you're still like, I don't know. So I would say lean into that. Behavioral questions, they're magic, they're helpful. That's a really great place to start. Reverse engineer your criteria. That's really, really nice way to start. I wish that there was in the interview pair situation. I have one colleague that every now and then brings in her pair is someone outside her company. I think we should do it more often. She learned a ton about different ways of hiring and different processes. That person learned a ton. They weren't, competing companies. And so that's, if you can find someone who is really good at hiring equitably, I don't know why we don't do that more. Cool. Yeah. Folks weigh in.
Other questions? Oh, all the way back. Sorry.
So I am in 100% agreement with you that do I want to have a beer with this person, or variants like, do I want to play board games with this person? Did this person go to the same college as me? Are terrible ways to hire, and also sort of bad ways to conduct business in general. Like, you have to be flexible enough to build relationships with people in ways that they're equally comfortable with. My problem is that people who don't have that mindset, I'm having a hard time bridging the gap and communicating that idea to them, because they don't think, oh, I'm having a beer with people because I want to be bigoted. They're thinking, oh, this is just a great way to get to know people. And it seems to be a pretty different mindset in terms of values and how you approach the world. And I'm wondering how you've found successful to bridge that gap.
Yeah, there on my links and resources, there's this really interesting article that was done by an HR think tank about why is it so impossible to convince people that structured interviewing is kind of the only way. It's an article about how resistant organizations and individuals are. So what you're experiencing is very, very, very normal, alas. I have found two ways. One is take it one tactic at a time. So you can do one or two, both of these. But the first one is it's sometimes really easy to change one thing if you understand. I mean, this is like influence 101. What does the person care about? And so you're not going to use the same thing for every person. If you know that this person cares about efficiency, be like, hey, I heard of this new tactic that's way faster to create a job description. Next time we hire, would you be interested in trying it out? You know that it also increases equity, right, and decreases bias. But it also is not a lie. It's way more efficient. So know their drivers, know their motivators, and then try suggesting a tactic. Do some of the heavy lifting in the beginning. Be like, I got the worksheet, I got this. Secondly, everyone cares about equity, and you have to be a sociopath. I'm not. That's not a joke. If you're a sociopath, you don't care about equity because you don't have empathy. It's the diagnosis, right? Everyone else cares about equity. The issue is they might feel that it's an either or, that trying to be more equitable is actually getting in the way of something else they're also really, really stressed out about, maybe more so than equity, like workflow, just workload, like changing stuff. I can't handle another change. So starting with a tactic at a time is a nice way. And also, I've been pleasantly surprised when I send people an article about hey, I know we care about equity. That's called priming, by the way, and influence. I know we care about equity. Why would they disagree with that? I know we care about equity. Here's an article I read about how these two tactics massively increase it, and here's why I think they wouldn't change much. Can I get your thoughts on it? You're not saying, can we do this tactic? You're saying, can I get your thoughts on it? And that just kind of do that. But definitely you're talking about influence, which is a whole cool workshop. And change management. I've actually told. I don't think it's on. I can hear you and repeat it. Yeah. Yeah, do you want to take that?
Sure. Am I on?
You're
am
on.
on. So that's a whole nother talk, which would be really fun. But
Rachel, can you repeat what the question was? We
Are
can't
there
hear in
any
the back.
ways, and correct me if I'm wrong, any ways to bypass or circumvent the amygdala hijack in interview situations? Or just in any situation? Work appropriate, yeah. I mean, those are going to be some of the same tactics for dealing with like a high stress or high anxiety moment. Those are going to be, so a lot of the things are talking to yourself and like retraining your brain to calm down. Like that's actually, I wish I had I wish I had all that data, but there are ways to do it. There are ways to, unfortunately, there's no way to circumvent an amygdala hijack. There are ways, so the way that I was approaching it in my talk is there are ways for your whole company to circumvent giving each other amygdala hijacks because nobody wants to lose those IQ points, and then nobody wants to spread that loss of IQ points to everyone else they're around. So some of the things, like basically, I kind of subscribe to the theory that everything that can be applied outwardly can be applied inwardly. And so I actually just apply some of those things I said, like you can talk about your feelings and it actually moves your brain activity back to the PFC.
Affect labeling.
Yes, it's called affect labeling. And I actually have on my slides, which I will somehow distribute, Aaron, Diederik, if I can somehow distribute them. But affect labeling is figuring out what it is and then talking about it. And then there's ways to discern what is actually affecting your brain. But affect labeling is actually what, his name is Dr. Matthew Lieberman. He works at the University of Chicago. His whole spiel, his whole deal in life is affect labeling and how to use that to actually, again, like this was his study that I cited there. So Dr. Matthew Lieberman. And he will talk about how basically affect labeling can help the whole community, but it can also help yourself. So when you're talking to other people, it's really good for your brain. It's letting people know your experiences, etc. But you also turn that inwardly and you talk about your experiences. You talk about what you're feeling. Right now, I am feeling anxious. I am feeling excluded because of this reason. And you can actually bring yourself back down a little. It doesn't solve the problem of obviously like community-wide exclusion or not feeling like you belong, but it can solve the problem for you. So just labeling and naming those people. Thank you.
This is a question for Paloma. You had on one of your slides that showed one of the top tactic that actually increased successful hires was giving an aptitude test.
Oh yeah, the aptitude test is the closest. Structured interviewing is the closest we've gotten to an aptitude test for harder to quantify skills, right? Like interpersonal skills. So the aptitude, there's there's two, but one of the more leading companies that I know of that's got some good data as well is Gap Jumpers. Gap Jumpers is a new company. It's a startup. They are working towards essentially creating aptitude tests that at the same time erase all demographic information from a candidate. And there's they have really big clients already. Google, I think Nike, a few others are already using them. They've done maybe 3 years of tests. And so the aptitude test, what I hear a lot from people is like, well, I'm hiring an engineer. Like I can do some testing, about their code, but there's a bunch of other stuff that I just need to interview for. And so structured interviewing is the closest we get to an aptitude test for things like interpersonal skills, values, culture forward fit, stuff like that. Was that your question?
Yeah, actually that was helpful because it wasn't necessarily offering a best practice to give aptitude tests. It was you were comparing structured interviews as kind of the best way.
Yeah, and in my hurry, I forgot to say that's the closest we can do. Structured interviewing is the closest we can do to an actual aptitude test because that's actually what you're doing, right? You're asking the same questions to every candidate and against criteria. Like it's weirdly a test when you're doing a series of tests. I don't like to call them tests so much because people are like, whoa, we're not going to give our candidates tests. And I'm like, no, it's not really. We're just trying to mimic an aptitude test because they're so much more effective than we are by just intuition.
We have time for one more question if anyone has one.
I wanted to ask about, during the interview process, about linguistic things. So what if somebody matches all the criteria and yet there's people who can't understand them when they're speaking because of accents or different kinds of verb use, things like, how do you work with that?
That's true. I mean, what's interesting about success criteria is in the interview process, there's through the interviews, you might learn that there's basic criteria that one of the candidates doesn't meet that you didn't think of because you hadn't come up with that. So one of them might be like, oh, we didn't think about negotiation skills requiring high level enough of a French proficiency so that they can talk with our French team. And you're like, damn, okay, where do we, I guess, right? So I would say go back to your original criteria and say, can the person do this job? Can we be flexible with them and then still do this criteria in order to achieve this success thing we set out for them? And sometimes the answer is actually, yeah, weirdly they can. We may just need to be comfortable asking them to repeat themselves, and we need to see if they're okay with that. They probably are, because this isn't their first language and they're also trying and working really hard on that. And then you might be like, oh, actually, we're okay with that. They're okay with that. All the other criteria they match. We believe they can do this. They might need some. And sometimes you might be like, actually, I don't know. And at that point, you can absolutely, I recommend that you go to HR if you're like, ooh, this one's iffy. Because they're really, really helpful with the iffy ones. There's some, I interviewed someone who had a severe, essentially a kind of rare type of epilepsy. And we were going to be hiring them into an acute healthcare environment, which was outside in. And we had to make a really hard call. We were like, we don't know what to do with, like, they otherwise are our candidate, they're like our unicorn. And so we had to talk to doctors, we had to talk to HR and be like, we've got a tough one. So if you have a tough one, by the way, it means you're being thorough. So yay, you're doing it right. Because you're like, whoa, we got a hard one. So yeah.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Well, thank you again. Can we have one last round of applause for Paloma and Rachel?
You did it. Done it.